The city seemed like a living organism, full of sounds, voices, and an almost imperceptible tension, as if something ominous, invisible but tangible, lingered in the air. People bustled through the streets, but their faces expressed not so much busyness as fear. The mighty city walls, once an impenetrable protection, now felt more like a reminder of a cage from which escape was impossible. The artificial sun bathed the streets in golden light, but even that could not dispel the sense of an impending catastrophe. Children cried more often than usual. Adults spoke in hushed tones, glancing around as if their words might summon disaster. Beggars extended their hands for alms, their clothing hanging in tatters, and their eyes burning with despair. Refugees crowded the streets, having left their homes in hopes of finding salvation. Agna walked among the throng, trying to quiet the guilt that clung to her heart like a sticky serpent. In her hands, she carried a basket covered with a cloth. From beneath it wafted the appetizing smell of freshly baked pastries. She was headed to the orphanage, where children who had lost their parents lived. Agna felt hungry gazes follow her. She saw some passers-by inhale the aroma and lick their lips greedily, but no one dared approach. The orphanage was located in a dark alley at the very end of the street. There were no lamps or torches here, only thick shadows that seemed to be waiting for something. Agna thought to herself that she should tell one of the city craftsmen to add lighting. As she took a few steps, she heard a raspy voice behind her. "Hey, sister," someone said, and there was something slithering in that voice. Turning, Agna saw 3 men. They looked like people who had long lost themselves. Dirty clothes, hollow faces, hungry eyes. One held a club, another a chain, and the third merely clenched his fists, though his gaze was more menacing than any weapon. "Leave the basket and walk away," said the one with the club. Agna gave them a stern look, her voice firm. "If you're hungry, they serve porridge in the square every morning. That should solve your problems." The man with the club sneered, spat on the ground, and growled, "We're sick of that slop. You eat it yourself. What's in your basket smells a lot better, so, unless you want trouble, leave it and scram." Agna sighed. Slowly setting the basket on the ground, she removed her cloak and took a step forward. "If you want the food so badly, try taking it." The men exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this response. But the one with the club stepped forward. He swung at her, but Agna deftly sidestepped, slipping to his side. With a swift motion, she twisted his arm, and the club thudded to the ground. "You'll regret this, you wench," shouted the second man, swinging the chain. But Agna was ready. She caught the chain mid-swing, yanked it out of his hands, and shoved him against the wall. The third man charged at her, but as if predicting his move, she kicked him in the stomach and then struck his chin with her elbow. He collapsed, clutching his face. When it was over, the men lay groaning on the ground, muttering curses under their breath. Agna approached the basket, pulled out 3 pastries, and tossed them near the fallen men. "Behave yourselves, please," she said calmly, and continued on her way. The orphanage was a small building with peeling walls and a moss-covered roof. 2 large pots with dried flowers stood on the porch. Inside, it was cramped but clean. As soon as the children saw Agna, they cheered joyfully. "Agna's here! Agna!" The smallest child, a boy with messy hair, ran up and hugged her tightly. She ruffled his hair and smiled, feeling warmth spread through her chest. "I brought some pastries for you. Share them, okay?" The children surrounded her, eagerly peeking into the basket. They happily took the pastries, each one gratefully repeating her name. Agna spoke briefly with the caretaker, promising to bring more supplies if needed. When she stepped out of the orphanage, the alley was empty. The men were gone. She paused for a moment, exhaled tiredly, and headed back. New responsibilities awaited her ahead. Agna approached the door to High Priestess Lucia's office, her nerves refusing to settle. Today would be her first lesson in true magic. After months of training with the sword, she finally felt she was nearing her goal. Summoning her courage, she knocked. "Enter," came a calm yet commanding voice. Agna opened the door and saw Lucia standing by the window. The High Priestess of the Order of the Moonlit Night looked majestic. Her long silver hair cascaded down to her waist, and her robe, adorned with patterns of the starry sky, emphasized her noble bearing. She gazed intently out the window, as though observing something of great importance. Agna stepped closer and glanced outside. In the alley below, a scene unfolded. 3 older teens had surrounded 2 younger children. It looked like the start of a fight. "Bullies," Agna muttered under her breath, clenching her fist. Lucia smirked. "Sometimes it feels as though people aren't worth our efforts. Even in the darkest times, they fight each other instead of uniting." She paused, then gestured to the street. "But look closely." From a nearby alley, several more teens emerged quickly, surrounding the aggressors. The bullies recoiled, their confidence evaporating as they began to retreat, trembling. Within moments, they vanished around the corner. The 2 younger children, now safe, hugged their defenders joyfully. Together, they left the alley. Agna couldn't help but smile at the sight. Lucia turned to her and noticed her expression. "Remember, Agna, even in the darkest chaos, there will always be those who bring light. Now come, your lesson awaits." The priestess led her out of the room, and soon they arrived at a garden surrounded by towering trees. The space was dim, with only occasional rays of light piercing through the dense canopy. Lucia raised her hand, whispered something, and tiny stars burst forth from her palm. They scattered throughout the garden, illuminating it with a soft, shimmering glow. The surroundings came alive with fantastic colors. Agna, mesmerized by the sight, turned to Lucia. The priestess was gazing at the sky, obscured by dark clouds, and began to speak. Many believe that lunar magic comes from the celestial body itself. That is only part of the truth. In reality, lunar magic is all around us. It is as much a part of the world as solar magic. The two complement each other, balancing the scales. The moon simply amplifies this magic, making it accessible to those who know how to draw upon it. She looked at Agna. If the sun burns, the moon preserves. That is the foundation of our order. This is why we live longer than the priests of solar magic. But our path is less popular. People think of us as allies of the dark. In truth, we are the light in the darkness. Lucia stepped closer. To feel the moon's magic, you must imagine yourself surrounded by countless tiny particles of energy. Let them become part of you, flowing through your body, your veins, your heart. She opened her palm, revealing a silver stone that glowed with a faint, cold light. This is mechalite, a stone that enhances lunar magic. I've tested you before and know there's a block within you. This barrier is preventing you from accessing magic. Take it focus and try to break through. Agna took the stone, its coldness sending a shiver through her fingers, like an icy wind. She sat on the ground, closed her eyes, and tried to envision the energy around her. In her mind, tiny stars began to sparkle, surrounding her, circling, then slowly drawing into her body. Warm energy flowed through her veins, filling her from within. But suddenly everything stopped. The energy froze, as if it had hit an invisible wall. Recall your past, Lucia said softly. Find what caused this barrier. Agna tensed. Memories began surfacing from the depths of her mind. She gripped the stone tighter, and before her inner eye, images of her past began to unfold. Young Agna lay in bed, wrapped in a soft blanket while her mother sat beside her. She was a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a warm smile that radiated comfort. "Mom, please show me magic again," the girl begged, her voice filled with childish wonder. Her mother shook her head gently, smiling. "Agna, magic isn't a toy. I can't show it to you every night." "Please, Mom," the girl insisted, clasping her hands together. Her mother sighed, but seeing the joy on her daughter's face, she relented. Whispering something barely audible, she opened her palm and a tiny orb of light appeared, softly illuminating the room and casting playful reflections on the walls. "It's so beautiful," Agna exclaimed, clapping her hands. "Mom, will I be able to do that too?" Her mother stroked her hair, her eyes shining with affection. "Of course you will. If you work hard, you'll become the greatest sorceress in the kingdom." The girl eagerly extended her hand, straining with all her might to create something similar. Her mother chuckled softly. "Relax, sweetheart. It doesn't come from trying too hard." But then, a faint light flickered in Agna's tiny palm. Her mother froze, covering her mouth in astonishment. "Mom, look! I did it!" the girl exclaimed, but the light quickly faded. Her mother embraced her tightly, pride and wonder sparkling in her eyes. Yet the next memory swept over her like a storm. Night. Darkness. The streets were deserted as mother and daughter made their way home from the market. The soft glow of her mother's orb lit their path. Suddenly, several men emerged from an alley, their faces cruel and drunken, twisted into sneering grins. "Witch!" one of them hissed, blocking their way. Agna's mother pulled her daughter close. "Please let us pass. We're just going home." The men laughed, and one of them, swaying slightly, drew a knife. "Let you go? Oh no! A witch, and the Count's wife no less." He spat venomously. "Your husband caused our suffering, you'll pay for it." Her mother stepped back, holding Agna protectively. When one of the men lunged forward, she raised her hand, and a brilliant beam of light knocked him off his feet. "Run, Agna!" her mother cried, but the girl was paralyzed by fear. The other men charged her mother. One struck her on the head with a club, and blood splattered onto the cobblestones. Agna screamed as her mother fell to the ground. The woman looked at her daughter, her eyes filled with pain and love. "Run!" she whispered. Her hand flared with blinding light, momentarily stunning the attackers. Agna ran. She ran until she could no longer move, then hid. The next day, the guards found her. Her mother was dead. The culprits were captured and hanged. These memories haunted Agna for years. She had been unable to use magic since, as if fear had taken hold of her heart. Sitting on the grass, Agna gripped the mechalite tightly. Her mind swirled with emotions. Love for her mother, the bitterness of loss, fear, and suddenly, a fierce determination to overcome her limits. She remembered her mother's words, that she would become a great sorceress. She felt energy swirling around her like stars. It began to flow into her, growing stronger. But the barrier forged from her fears still stood. Agna pushed harder, directing her strength against the obstacle. Lucia stepped forward in alarm. "Agna! Don't draw in so much. It's dangerous. You could hurt yourself." But Agna couldn't hear her anymore. Magic surrounded her like a storm. The wind picked up leaves and branches, spinning them around her. The barrier inside cracked, then shattered. In the moment it broke, there was a brilliant flash of light. Agna rose into the air, surrounded by radiance. She felt the magic coursing through her body, filling every cell. She was no longer afraid. The light around her began to fade, and she gently descended back to the ground. When Agna opened her eyes, Lucia was staring at her, astonished. You broke through the block, and you're not the same anymore." Agna stood, feeling the power within her. Not just magic, but the confidence that she could finally become who she had always wanted to be. Time passed, and Agna devoted herself daily to her training. She studied lunar magic under Lucia's guidance, who was increasingly amazed at how gifted her pupil was. Since breaking her inner barrier, magic had become second nature to Agna. The High Priestess marveled at how effortlessly the girl absorbed new knowledge, as if she intuitively grasped the essence of every spell. But Agna hadn't abandoned her past passion, swordsmanship. She had trained with a blade since childhood and wasn't about to give it up. Memories of Richard, who combined magic with swordplay, often came to mind. Although such practices were traditionally seen as a man's domain within the order, Agna saw an opportunity. Lucia taught her the priestess's magic, which, while powerful, wasn't designed to pair with a blade. Agna, however, wanted to forge something new, melding lunar magic with combat in her own unique style. Her days were filled with study and practice, but Agna occasionally ventured beyond the Order's walls to walk the city streets and help those in need. On one such day, she carried a basket of pastries and headed to the orphanage. The city seemed unchanged. Tension lingered in the air. People hurried about their business, and refugees and beggars lined the walls, hoping for charity. The air carried a mix of dust and unease. As she walked through the streets, Agna noticed a caravan. Recent arrivals to the city were moving slowly, their faces marked with exhaustion and despair. The creak of overloaded wagons echoed around them, and the travelers looked as though even this city, their last hope, offered little solace. Agna stopped to let the caravan pass, observing the people closely. One man stood out among the others. Limping and leaning heavily on a staff, his tattered clothes and tangled, unkempt hair obscured much of his face. He moved as if he wasn't part of the group, his steps growing more erratic with each passing moment. A chill ran down Agna's spine. Suddenly, the man froze, his body convulsing violently. The staff fell from his grasp, and his head snapped upward. Agna caught a glimpse of his face and felt a wave of horror. His skin was marred with glowing red cracks, like veins radiating beneath the surface. His eyes flared with a blood-red light, and a guttural, beast-like roar escaped his mouth. Panic rippled through the crowd as people fled in terror. The man's transformation accelerated, his limbs elongated grotesquely, his arms and legs becoming unnaturally long and clawed. His face stretched into the lupine features of a monstrous creature. His spine arched and jagged, pulsing red growths burst from his back. Veins bulged across his body and his skin split, revealing muscle that glowed like molten embers. "The Red Blight," Agna whispered. She recognized the sickness, an infernal plague that turned people into monsters. Setting her basket on the ground, Agna drew her sword. Fear clashed with determination in her heart, but she forced it aside. Channeling lunar magic into her blade, she took a step forward. The monster snarled, its blood-red eyes locking onto her, and lunged. Agna sidestepped its claws, retreating as she swung her sword. The blade, glowing with silver light, cut deep into the creature's flesh. It roared in pain, swiping at her with a massive claw. Agna raised her hand, releasing a beam of lunar energy. The brilliant light forced the creature back, but only momentarily. The monster lunged again, its claws slashing wildly. Agna ducked under its attack and struck its leg, severing the flesh down to the knee. The beast collapsed but immediately began to rise again, emitting a chilling howl. Its body pulsed, veins swelling as the plague worked to regenerate its injuries. Agna didn't relent. She focused her magic once more, and her blade flared with bright silver light. With a final decisive strike, she cleaved the monster in two. Its body crumpled to the ground, but the plague within it wasn't finished. Crimson tendrils began spreading across the ground, seeking to infect anything in their path. Raising her hand, Agna unleashed a concentrated beam of lunar energy. The light engulfed the creature's remains, purging the infernal magic. The body and tendrils disintegrated in a flash of light, leaving behind only the scent of charred air and an eerie silence. Agna stared at the blackened remains of the creature, now free of the red veins. She wiped sweat from her brow and sheathed her sword, her heart still racing. In that moment, she realized this was only the first sign. The plague had reached the city, and with it, new threats loomed on the horizon. Richard stood before a monumental stone wall that stretched endlessly, as if attempting to connect the earth with the heavens. This cliff was the very place they had passed through once before. Its smooth surfaces seemed impenetrable, as though nature itself had forged this barrier to contain something that should never see the light. The vampire elder stood before the massive rock face, his cloak rippling in an invisible wind. When he raised his hand, the stone responded. A burning symbol, a green triangle, suddenly appeared on its surface, glowing ominously. The elder touched it, and the ground beneath their feet trembled. The rock seemed to groan before beginning to open. Massive slabs of stone shifted apart, revealing an entrance bathed in an unearthly glow, as if beckoning them inside. Richard glanced at Balthazar, who merely shrugged, though tension was evident on his face. Following the elder, the group stepped into the opening, Lenz and his parents, Finn, and the rest of the vampire clan trailing behind. Richard, suppressing his doubts, joined them. The corridor beyond was carved with flawless precision. The stone walls were so smooth it seemed no human hand had shaped them, but rather some otherworldly force. Only the faint echo of footsteps disturbed the silence. Richard ran his hand along the wall, feeling a chill that was strangely soothing, almost inviting. But their path was not a mere tunnel. When the corridor ended, they found themselves in a hall that surpassed anything Richard could have imagined. This was a hall fit for gods. The floor was polished white marble, gleaming like a mirror. The walls displayed living images, not paintings but moving scenes that shifted and changed as though trying to tell their stories. One scene depicted a battle, another the birth of a star, and a third, a strange creature that seemed to stare directly at Richard with its abyssal eyes. Statues stood along the perimeter, carved with such precision they could be mistaken for living beings. Some depicted warriors in battle armor, others mages holding orbs that emitted a faint glow. Above them loomed a ceiling that disappeared into darkness, studded with shimmering stars. At the center of the hall stood a massive pedestal, black as night. It drew the eye as though it was the heart of this place. The elder approached it, his movements calm yet deliberate. He ran his hand over its surface and it began to glow, revealing hidden symbols that lit up one by one, forming intricate patterns. "What kind of magic is this?" Richard murmured, more to himself than anyone else. The symbols shifted, transforming into a map. Richard recognized it immediately. It was Ardentia, their kingdom. But the map was marred with pulsating red spots that seemed alive. "The plague is spreading further," the elder said. His brow furrowed. "Plague?" Richard repeated, his voice louder than he intended. "Yes, they call it the Crimson Blight," the elder nodded. "You may have already encountered its effects." Images flashed through Richard's mind. The living lighthouse, the creature in the forest. Everything suddenly made sense. "The Crimson Blight is the key to Sharrock's resurrection," the elder continued. "He is the one responsible for the creation of these monsters. Infected animals mutate into abominations and infected humans." The elder trailed off, his gaze heavy. "Humans are the priority target. When their numbers reach a critical mass, their souls and blood become the key to unlocking the prison where the dark god is sealed." Richard froze. "We were among those who sealed him in this dimension," the elder went on. "We watched him annihilate all life in his path. We joined forces with local heroes to imprison him, but it came at a great cost. We fell victim to a curse and were trapped here." "A trap?" Balthazar echoed. "Yes. Had we not left this fortress, the enemy could not have reached us. But this fortress," the elder glanced at the walls, "it remains our only legacy. This cliff, stretching like a wall, is our stronghold. It is equipped with our final creations." Still processing the revelations, Richard finally asked, "So who do I need to find?" The elder stood in the center of the hall, his gaze fixed on the map, pulsing with a soft red glow. His voice was measured, but a thread of unease ran through it. "His name is Andor. He is one of our elders and the one who saved Adrain," he said, glancing briefly at Lenz, who tensed slightly. "He was one of the few who escaped the curse. All this time, Andor was supposed to care for our descendant and monitor the manifestations of the Crimson Blight, standing as a sentinel for this world." The elder paused, frowning. "I don't know what happened for him to leave our descendant with a stranger. Something serious must have occurred. Perhaps he was trying to protect us or battling something even more dangerous. But I am certain of one thing. He knows where the Crimson Widow is." "The Crimson Widow?" Lenz repeated sharply. "It is the being that spawns the Crimson Blight," the elder explained. "We have long searched for traces of this creature. It is the key to our enemy's return. Your task is to find Andor and learn the Widow's location, then destroy it before it's too late." The elder fell silent for a moment, then added, "Meanwhile, we will gather our forces and prepare weapons for the possible battle." "And if a battle comes, where will it happen?" Richard asked, struggling to suppress his unease. The elder regarded him with a long, serious look. "Follow the monsters. That is where we will meet." Richard wanted to ask more, but decided to piece it together as they went. "How will we find your elder?" Balthazar asked. "Use the needle again?" "No," the elder shook his head. "The guiding needle is a family artifact. Andor is not of their lineage. But I have something better." He raised his hand, and the map before him began to pulse. A shimmering dot appeared in the south, near the coast, amidst a forest. The elder muttered something under his breath, and from above descended an object resembling a medallion, radiating a faint glow. "We all wear special medallions that can be tracked. This one will guide you to Andor," he said, handing the medallion to Lenz. "Only you can use it." Lenz carefully took it, touching the symbol on its surface. A small map with a pulsing marker appeared before the medallion. "Follow this map," the elder instructed. "Every second counts." They all nodded. Len said his goodbyes to his parents, who embraced him with restrained but evident affection. The elder raised his hand, and an archway appeared on the opposite wall. The stone seemed to come alive, reshaping itself at his command. "This corridor will lead you outside," the elder said. Passing through the living wall, the group emerged into an open space. Darkness surrounded them completely until Richard realized where they were, the very place where they had left their mounts. Just as he made this connection, the sound of rapid footsteps reached them. First came a massive wolf with powerful antlers, its eyes shining with joy. Behind it lumbered an equally large bear, whose growl sounded more like a contented rumble. And last, but by no means least, a donkey bounded over, braying happily. The animals rushed to their owners, circling them excitedly, unable to contain their happiness. The wolf approached Richard, lowering its head with a deep, satisfied sound. The bear hovered near Finn, while the donkey nearly toppled Balthazar, nuzzling against him affectionately. Richard chuckled, though a flicker of concern crossed his mind. Let's just hope they don't crush us in their enthusiasm. The elder observed the reunion from a distance, his expression calm, though his eyes carried a shadow of doubt. "Good luck," he said. "We will meet again." Richard and the others responded with nods. They mounted their companions and set off, following the map. Lens held. The forest ahead loomed dark and foreboding, but Richard knew there was no longer any time for hesitation. The group moved as quickly as their mounts could carry them. Richard felt the tension growing with each passing moment. Monsters darted through the shadows of the forest and along the slopes of the hills, but the party ignored them, racing past without engaging. Time felt like an enemy now, and the elder's words echoed in Richard's mind like a warning. Every second counts. After covering a great distance, they decided to make camp. The fire crackled, casting long shadows across their faces. Its warmth was deceptive. It offered physical comfort, but their thoughts remained heavy. Richard glanced at Lens, who sat staring into the flames. He seemed focused, but there was a longing in his eyes. With a sigh, Richard spoke. "I'm sorry we had to separate you from your parents. I imagine you'd have liked to talk to them, to make sense of everything." Lens slowly lifted his gaze and gave a faint smile. "It's fine. The important thing is that they're alive. We'll have time to talk once we defeat this evil." His final words hung in the air. Finn, sitting across the fire, tossed a stick into the flames. "If we win," he muttered darkly. Balthazar cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. His deep, resonant voice cut through the tension. "We don't know what will happen to us, but we can do everything in our power to see the future we dream of. Don't doubt. Just keep moving forward. And remember those who stand behind you. Your loved ones, the people who need protection." Simple as the words were, they stirred something within each of them. Silently, they nodded, each lost in their own thoughts. Richard turned away from the fire, gazing into the dark sky. The past months flashed before his mind's eye. Endless chases, battles, training. He realized he'd grown used to this chaos, that it had become a part of him. But would it ever end? He didn't know. An hour later, rested and replenished, the group pressed onward. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, they reached their destination. A forest unlike any other they had seen. This place seemed to exhale malevolence. The twisted branches of the trees writhed like the arms of maddened creatures, and a dense shadow cloaked everything beneath. The air was thick with an unpleasant, cloying odor, a mix of blood and decay. Each step felt labored, as though an unseen force sought to weigh them down. "This place is steeped in something foul," Balthazar murmured, scanning their surroundings. Richard raised a hand, signaling them to halt. "We go on foot from here," he said. The forest seemed dead, yet it breathed darkness. The trees, stripped of their leaves, stood like skeletal sentinels, their twisted branches reaching into the air like ghastly claws. It felt as though a fire had once swept through, leaving charred husks in its wake, but the air was cold and damp, with no scent of smoke. An unnatural silence pervaded the area, broken only by faint, eerie sounds. Somewhere in the distance, a branch cracked. Nearby, there was a strange howl, like the cry of a dying animal. Occasionally, a rustling noise suggested someone or something moving stealthily through the underbrush. Richard and the others moved carefully, striving to make no sound. Each step was deliberate, each glance filled with tension. "Quiet," Richard whispered, glancing back at his companions. What worried him most were the animals. The massive wolf and bear, despite their size, moved with remarkable stealth, blending into the eerie rhythm of the forest. The problem lay elsewhere, with the donkey named King. Balthazar rode him, struggling to keep the animal in check. King seemed determined to let out loud brays, flaring his nostrils and glancing nervously around. "One more noise and you'll be dinner," Balthazar muttered, leaning close to the donkey's ear. King snorted but fell silent. They pressed onward. Strange plants dotted their path, some with withered, blackened leaves that crumbled at the slightest touch, others grotesquely alive, their roots and stems covered in bulbous, tumor-like growths. One bush even shifted when Finn accidentally brushed it with his dagger. Before long, they stumbled upon bones. Some were clearly animal remains, but others defied easy identification. One skull had an elongated, almost reptilian shape, with large teeth more fitting for a predator. Another skeleton belonged to a three-legged creature, its structure alien and unsettling. "I've never seen animals like this," Richard murmured, frowning. "And I hope I never do again," Finn muttered. Their path led them to a peculiar sight. Through the dense darkness of the forest, a chain of lights flickered ahead. The lights moved like a snake, winding through the trees. The group froze, exchanging uneasy glances. Lenz checked the medallion's map. The lights are moving in the same direction the medallion points. "Then we follow them," Richard decided. They advanced cautiously, staying within the shadows. As they crept closer, the figures carrying the lights came into view. Richard squinted, and what he saw sent a chill through his blood. These creatures resembled humans, but only vaguely. Their bodies were covered in thick, matted fur, and where their heads should have been were goat-like faces with long, curved horns. Their eyes glowed a dull red, and their massive, twisted jaws bristled with sharp teeth. They walked on two legs, holding torches in their clawed hands. One of them paused, sniffing the air as though searching for a scent. But what drew Richard's gaze most was the being at the center of the procession. It was a massive, hulking figure, resembling a filthy, hairy mass coated in dark, slimy ooze. Long, tangled strands of hair dragged behind it, leaving a foul trail on the ground. From the monstrous body, two glistening eyes peered out, and its gaping maw, lined with jagged, crooked teeth, opened periodically as if to suck in the air. Richard felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "What is that thing?" Finn whispered. "I don't know," Richard replied softly. "But they're heading somewhere." The creatures continued moving with purpose, as if driven by a singular goal. The group decided to follow them, keeping to the cover of the trees. No one spoke, but the tension was palpable, as though the forest itself, no, something far worse, had begun watching them. The clearing to which the lights had led them was a horrifying sight. The forest surrounding it was so dense that the flickering torchlight cast sinister shadows that danced on the gnarled tree trunks. At the center of the clearing stood an altar carved from black stone, its surface covered in ancient runes that glowed faintly with a blood-red light. Nearby, a massive rectangular stone loomed, resembling a tomb or an ancient monolith. Around it stood the goat-like creatures, holding torches aloft, their dim light amplifying the oppressive atmosphere. The creatures were silent, their glowing eyes fixed on the hulking, matted leader at the altar. The monstrosity turned to face its audience and began emitting broken, piercing screams, like the sound of a gale roaring through a cavernous maw. The cries were unnatural, and each time they ceased, the goat creatures raised their torches high, answering with prolonged, unified howls. The eerie rhythm sent shivers down Richard's spine. With every passing minute, more creatures emerged from the forest, filling the clearing. Their grotesque, goat-like faces turned toward the altar, and their torches illuminated scenes of ancient terror. When the hairy monstrosity finished its cries, one of the goat creatures stepped forward. This one was enormous, far larger than the others. It approached the altar, hefting a massive hammer that had been resting nearby. With a powerful swing, it brought the hammer down on the stone monolith. The sound of the impact echoed through the forest like a thunderclap. Sparks flew from the surface, but the stone remained intact. The creature struck again, each blow resonating with a deep hum that seemed to vibrate through the earth. Despite the relentless power behind each swing, the monolith showed no signs of breaking. The beast eventually slowed, its strength waning. Another creature stepped forward to take its place, continuing the assault without hesitation. The group watched from the shadows of the trees. Lenz glanced at the medallion. "We're here," he whispered. "But where's Andor?" They exchanged uneasy glances. The clearing offered no obvious clues. Everything seemed to center on the stone monolith, as though it were the creature's ultimate objective. Balthazar stroked his beard thoughtfully, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then his expression brightened. "Could it be?" he muttered. Richard turned to him. "What?" "The stone. Maybe he's inside the stone," Balthazar replied, pointing to the monolith. "Remember how the Elder manipulated the cliff face? They have the technology to conceal and control stone. Maybe these creatures are trying to get to Andor." The idea was shocking, but it made sense. If Andor was indeed trapped within the monolith, the creature's actions suddenly became clear. This was a trap they had to break. Richard glanced at Enzio, the massive wolf sitting beside him, tail twitching in irritation. "How about stretching your legs a bit, buddy?" he asked. Enzio bared his teeth, his eyes glinting with predatory fire. Without a sound, the wolf lunged forward, crashing into the throng of monsters. His massive jaws snapped with a sickening crunch, and his claws tore deep gashes into the creatures. The clearing erupted in chaos as Fury, the bear, charged in with a thunderous roar, toppling goat-like beings with swipes of his massive paws. Balthazar, watching the pandemonium, turned to his donkey. "Well, King, care to join the fray?" The donkey let out an indignant bray and backed away. Meanwhile, the battle was in full swing. Enzio and Fury wreaked havoc, but the creatures were not just savage, they were intelligent. They quickly regrouped, forming a circle around the animals. From the shadows, spears began to fly with terrifying precision. The wolf and bear were in danger. "We've got to help them," Finn shouted, drawing his dagger. Richard nodded, gripping his sword tightly. "To battle!" he commanded. They burst from their hiding place, charging toward the monsters. Richard charged into the crowd of monsters, sword in hand. The blade, imbued with radiant magic, left flashes of light in its wake. Every movement was precise, every slash tearing the grotesque bodies of goat-like creatures apart. One of them leaped at him, but Richard spun around, raising his sword, and unleashed a surge of magic. A silvery beam of light struck the creature, ripping it into dozens of burning fragments. The powerful explosion also tore nearby beasts to shreds. To his left, Balthazar was fighting with elegance. His staff, infused with lunar magic, sparkled like lightning. Each swing sent waves of light that pierced through enemies with deadly precision. One beam passed through 3 creatures simultaneously, leaving them smoldering on the ground. Balthazar fended off attacks with ease, his movements deliberate yet powerful. He seemed to relish the fight, occasionally throwing out a quip. "Who's next to taste the moon's power?" Lance fought nearby, his spear crackling with dark magic, moving with incredible speed. Black tendrils wreathed the weapon, and each strike dispatched monsters with fearsome efficiency. One creature tried to grab him from behind, but Lance spun, skewering it with his spear and hurling the carcass into the crowd, toppling several others. Finn used his natural magic, summoning thick vines from the earth. They wrapped around the monsters, binding their limbs before dragging them back into the ground. He moved swiftly, deftly slashing with his dagger at those who dared to come close. Soon, a dense network of vines surrounded him, holding dozens of creatures captive. Amid the chaos, Lance dashed toward the stone. Reaching the monolith, he pulled out a medallion he had kept hidden until now. For a moment he hesitated, studying the strange runes etched into the stone surface before pressing the artifact against the monolith. The medallion vibrated in his hand. The vibration spread to the stone, and cracks began to snake across its surface. At first, they were small and thin, but they grew rapidly. The stone emitted a resonant hum as if something inside was straining to break free. With a deafening crash, the monolith shattered into pieces. From the cloud of dust and debris emerged a figure, an old man cloaked in a long black robe, his face twisted with fury. His eyes scanned the battlefield, taking in the monsters and destruction. His anger was palpable like a scorching flame. "You've gone too far," he bellowed, his voice drowning out the clamor of the battle. Black stones rose around him, shrouded in a smoky aura. The elder wielded them with precision, each one striking its target unerringly. When a stone hit a monster's head, it exploded, leaving the creature in fragments. Despite his age, he moved with astounding speed, and no monster could get close to him. Then, a massive creature stepped forward, its filthy matted fur writhing like snakes. The strands extended toward everything nearby, capturing both humans and animals. Enzio and Fury were entangled in these tendrils, which tightened their grip relentlessly. Even Finn found himself ensnared, his nature magic powerless against this monstrosity. Richard tensed. Drawing upon all his strength, he summoned druidic magic that enveloped his body. His sword began to glow with an intense, blinding light. For a moment he stood still, focusing all his energy, then swung the sword with immense force, releasing a powerful wave of light. The silvery arc sliced through the creature, cleaving it apart. A piercing wail echoed across the clearing, and the writhing fur fell limp, releasing its captives. The remaining monsters began to retreat, but the elder would not allow them to escape. His wrath was unrelenting. The stones struck with terrifying accuracy, obliterating the creatures and leaving behind only charred remnants. When the last enemy had fallen, the elder stopped. His face remained tense, but a flicker of curiosity appeared in his eyes. Slowly, he turned to Lance, frowning, and asked, Could it really be you, Adrain?" the old man asked, his voice trembling with both disbelief and hope. Lance nodded. "Yes, it's me." A weary smile appeared on the elder's face. He exhaled deeply as if shedding a burden that had weighed on him for ages. "I'm glad you're safe, but what happened? How did you end up here?" Lance opened his mouth to reply, but the old man suddenly lifted his head. His eyes narrowed as he noticed the sky darken, streaked with crimson veins resembling bloody cracks. "Could it be that this day has come?" he murmured, his voice almost a whisper as if speaking to himself. Then he turned sharply to Lance, his tone brisk and commanding. "Tell me everything from the beginning." Lance began his tale, recounting the attack of the demons, the chase for the Crimson Maw, the Elder's instructions, and their arrival at this place. The old man listened in silence, his expression growing graver with every word. When Lance finished, the Elder cursed, his voice echoing across the clearing. "Those creatures have hounded me for far too long." His gaze swept over the group before settling on Lance. "In the past, when I took you as a child, I had to go into hiding. A demon was tracking me, and I had no choice but to leave you with others to throw it off my trail." He paused, his voice dropping into a grim tone. "We fought. I was wounded. I fled, but soon found myself surrounded. I had to resort to drastic measures. I encased myself in eternal stone and entered a deep slumber. It was my only chance to heal and regain my strength." The elder chuckled bitterly, his smile tinged with sorrow. "But even in my sleep, those creatures never left me alone. They hammered at the stone all these years like cursed wretches. I swear, if I see another monster, I'll tear it apart limb by limb." He began cursing again, his words growing harsher and more colorful with every sentence. His fury seemed ready to erupt once more. Richard listened with his arms crossed, but finally interjected. "We need to act. The elder said we must find the Crimson Widow and destroy her. We have to follow those orders." The old man fell silent at this, took a deep breath and nodded. "I know where she might be, but the path will not be easy." The group mounted their steeds once more, with the elder keeping pace alongside them. As promised, he unleashed his fury on any monsters that dared to approach. Every movement of his was filled with precision and power. The black stones he conjured tore through the air, shattering enemies with deafening force. His actions seemed almost mechanical, as though he were venting years of pent-up rage. The forest remained oppressive, its darkness unsettling. Creatures emerged from the shadows, hiding behind the trees, but the elder's magic ensured none survived. Richard led the group, watching as the old man dispatched monsters with ease. He couldn't help but wonder just how much anger and strength the elder had accumulated over the years. Finn, Lance, and Balthazar moved cautiously, ready to join the fight at a moment's notice, though so far they hadn't needed to. After a few hours, they finally emerged from the forest. They stood at the edge of a cliff, staring out over the raging sea. Enormous waves crashed against the rocks below, sending salty spray into the air. The water was dark blue, almost black, its surface occasionally breaking with furious flashes, as if the depths were trying to communicate with the sky. The wind howled in their ears, carrying what sounded like the whispers of ancient voices warning travelers of the perils ahead. "We've arrived," Andor said firmly. "There, ahead." "Is the Crimson Widow in the sea?" Lance asked, frowning. "No," Andor replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Beyond lies an island. That place is the source of her power." Richard remembered the first time he had encountered someone infected with the Crimson Plague. A twisted figure that emerged from the sea, as if born from its dark depths. It couldn't be a coincidence. "How do we get there?" Finn asked, glancing around. Andor didn't answer immediately. He pulled a strange device from his pocket, made of smooth stone etched with ancient runes. After a few deft movements, he placed it on the ground. The stone flared with light, and in moments, it began to grow, transforming into a massive platform. Its surface glowed softly with a bluish light, and low barriers formed along its edges. "It's like when we crossed the lake," Balthazar remarked, nudging the reluctant king, who stubbornly refused to climb aboard. The platform was large enough to hold everyone, including their animal companions. Once they were all aboard, Andor made a motion with his hand. The platform rose smoothly and began gliding over the waves. It hovered above the water, eliminating the roughness of the ride, though an aura of danger hung thick in the air. At first, everything seemed calm. The platform moved silently, slicing through the damp, salty air. The forest behind them disappeared from view, leaving only the endless expanse of water. The wind grew quieter, but its chill seeped into their bones. Suddenly, Richard noticed movement beneath the waves. It looked like a shadow darting with unnatural speed. "Something's down there," he said quietly, gripping his sword. The water erupted with a splash, and a monstrous creature leaped forth. It resembled a giant fish, but with elongated limbs covered in tattered fins. Its jaws bristled with jagged, uneven teeth, and its glowing red eyes burned with malice. The beast let out a roar, and more creatures like it scrambled onto the platform. Richard charged forward, meeting the first monster head-on. His sword, imbued with magic, sliced through its flesh, sending it screaming into oblivion. Behind him, Balthazar unleashed beams of light, piercing the monsters like spears. Each blast reduced the creatures to clouds of blood and gore. Finn summoned razor-sharp seaweed from beneath the platform, ensnaring the creatures' limbs and dragging them back into the water. Yet some broke free, forcing him to hurl his dagger to finish them off. Lance moved with lightning speed, his spear crackling with dark magic as it tore through the air, leaving deep wounds in the monsters' bodies. One of the creatures lunged at him, but Lance drove his spear into its throat and it collapsed lifelessly. Enzio and Fury, despite the confined space, tore through the monsters with ferocity. The wolf sank its teeth into throats, while the bear roared and knocked enemies off balance, breaking bones with its powerful swipes. But the monsters kept coming. The farther the platform moved, the more of them emerged. The sea boiled with activity, and the hideous creatures leaped onto the platform one after another, clawing at its edges, trying to tip it over. "We can't hold out much longer," Finn shouted, shoving another beast away. "Hold on!" Andor yelled back. "We're close!" The battle raged on. They fought tirelessly, fending off wave after wave of attacks. At last, in the distance, a faint red light appeared through the dense darkness. It was dim yet captivating, like a beacon guiding them forward. "The island is near," Andor said, his voice calm but tense. The closer they drew to the island, the more monsters swarmed them. The water boiled with the movements of these creatures, attacking the platform in relentless waves. Richard strained his eyes and saw the massive demon statues lining the shore. Their fearsome faces were carved with devilish precision, their horns and claws seeming ready to come alive at any moment. The statues encircled the island like sentinels, but they were far from the most terrifying aspect of the scene. The island itself was a writhing mass of monsters. Every inch of it teemed with creatures, from lesser abominations with mangled bodies to massive beings whose forms were obscured by the shadows. Richard had never seen such a concentration of these fiends. They were countless, united by a horrific red glow emanating from the island's center, filling the air with a crushing sense of dread. "There are too many," Finn murmured, barely fending off another monster clawing at the platform. Even the bravest among them paused momentarily, the sight of such a nightmare enough to shake anyone's resolve. Lance glanced at Richard. "What's the plan?" Richard tightened his grip on his sword, his voice firm. "We move forward. Fight them off as best as you can." The platform edged closer to the shore, but the monsters gave them no reprieve. They leaped onto the platform, filling the space with their dark forms, snarling and growling. Richard moved with blinding speed, his moonlit blade cleaving through the attackers. Each swing of his sword, infused with lunar magic, obliterated multiple creatures at once, leaving bursts of light and shredded remains in its wake. "Mount up!" Richard shouted, fending off another wave. The others obeyed. As the rest climbed onto their beasts, Richard remained on the platform, closing his eyes and summoning the druidic energy that coursed through his body. As they neared the shore, Richard took a deep breath, leaped into the air, and swung his sword with all his might. The silver light fused with his magic, transforming into a colossal beam that crashed onto the island. The ground quaked. A massive explosion rippled across the shore. One of the towering demon statues split in half, its fragments scattering and crushing nearby creatures. Hundreds of monsters were obliterated, leaving a scorched path leading directly toward the island's center. "Forward!" Richard bellowed, leaping onto Enzio. They dismounted the platform and charged ahead. The ground beneath their mounts' hooves and paws smoldered, and the air echoed with the monstrous screams of their adversaries. Yet the creatures didn't relent. They surged from the shadows, filling the space behind the group. The thunderous sound of their pursuit, claws scraping, feet pounding, was deafening. Ahead, a massive horde blocked their path, so densely packed it seemed impossible to break through. "This is madness," Finn muttered, gripping his dagger tightly. But Richard focused once more. The druidic magic, mingled with his own strength, surged through him again. His sword radiated blinding light. He leapt from Enzio, swung his blade, and unleashed another colossal beam of energy. The second explosion was even more devastating than the first. Monsters were hurled aside, and the scorched path stretched farther, clearing a way through the horde. Except they pressed on, galloping down the burned path and fending off the creatures still attacking them. Lance wielded his spear with dark magic, piercing any who drew too close. Finn used his nature magic to ensnare those who tried to block their path, roots bursting from the ground to entangle their enemies. Balthazar fired precise blasts of light from his staff, striking down monsters on either side. As they finally reached the source of the crimson light, they found themselves in a clearing devoid of trees. The ground was smeared with dark red stains resembling dried blood, and the air was thick with the metallic tang of decay. At the center of the clearing hovered a grotesque figure, a creature that seemed to embody the plague itself. The Crimson Widow was enormous, her form floating eerily above the ground. At first glance, she appeared to be a woman in a long gown, but on closer inspection, the gown was fashioned from jagged, protruding bones that formed sharp spikes. Her body pulsed with glowing red veins, flickering as though alive. From her head extended a massive vertical spike several feet high, topped with a horizontal beam forming a macabre cross. Dangling from the beam were ropes suspending limp, genderless bodies, swaying like marionettes on twisted strings. The creature's movements were fluid but became increasingly menacing with each passing moment. Suddenly, one of the marionettes slipped free and fell to the ground. In an instant, it began forming a cocoon. Richard's eyes widened in realization. This was the source of the monsters, the plague spreading itself through these creations. As he drew closer, he studied the widow's face. Her eyes were closed, but her mouth was lined with jagged, uneven teeth, hinting at the horror beneath her stillness. The monsters around them attacked with unrelenting fury. Their numbers swelled, throwing themselves at the group in waves. Finn summoned massive vines that whipped and hurled the creatures away, while Balthazar, perched atop King, unleashed beams of light that cut through the attackers with surgical precision. Enzio and Fury showed no mercy, tearing apart anything that came too close. Andor hovered above the battlefield, his conjured stones streaking through the air like meteors, tearing through the hordes with explosive force. Lance ascended into the air, his spear wreathed in dark magic, striking down enemies with swift, decisive blows. But Richard knew the monsters were merely a distraction. The true threat loomed before them. Gritting his teeth, he channeled his druidic magic into his blade and launched himself toward the Crimson Widow. His sword shimmered with ethereal energy as he struck, only to pass straight through her, as though she were a ghost. He landed hard behind her, disoriented. "What was that?" he muttered, glaring at the widow, who floated as though oblivious to his presence. Undeterred, he sprang again, putting all his strength into a second strike. Once more, his blade sliced through nothingness. This time, however, he brushed against one of the dangling marionettes. The lifeless figure slid from its rope and crumpled to the ground. For a moment, it lay still, but then it twitched, rose, and stumbled toward him, emitting a low guttural rasp. Richard swiftly slashed it in half, and the body disintegrated into ash. "I understand!" he shouted, turning to the others. "Destroy the marionettes! They're her defense!" Lance immediately soared higher, swinging his spear to sever the hanging bodies one by one. Andor's stones smashed into the marionettes with thunderous force, reducing them to dust. "Everyone else, hold the line!" Balthazar commanded, firing bursts of light at the swarming monsters. Finn, alongside Enzio and Fury, held the perimeter, their combined efforts ensuring no creature reached Richard and Lance. One by one, the marionettes fell, their lifeless forms writhing briefly on the ground before crumbling to ash. The Crimson Widow began to convulse, her once fluid movements turning erratic and chaotic. When only one marionette remained, her eyes suddenly snapped open. They glowed a vivid blood red, and Richard felt his heart freeze for an instant. The widow's jagged mouth stretched open, releasing a piercing scream that filled the air with palpable vibrations. The ground trembled beneath them, and the ropes binding her marionettes shattered as she surged skyward. The Crimson Widow spiraled upward, whipping the wind and dust into a violent storm. She ascended toward the blood-red clouds encircling the island, her scream intensifying with every moment. Then, with a sudden blinding flash, she exploded. The crimson light engulfed everything, consuming the clearing and the battlefield in its brilliance. For an instant, time seemed to halt, the world plunging into an eerie, deafening silence. The blinding flash of light finally faded, and for a few moments, the world seemed frozen. Even the monsters, which had been ferociously battling just seconds earlier, stopped in their tracks, raising their heads to the sky. Everyone on the battlefield, humans and beasts alike, stared upward in awe-struck silence, afraid to speak. The sky, once shrouded in black clouds, streaked with crimson veins, began to shift. Where the explosion had occurred, the clouds fractured like brittle glass. Crimson lines radiated outward from the center, spreading across the heavens, creating the appearance of an immense glowing fissure. The cracks pulsed with a blood-red light, as though the fabric of reality itself was tearing apart. "What is that?" Finn whispered, his voice trembling as he kept his eyes fixed on the ominous sky. Andor clenched his fists and spoke quietly, yet with grim certainty. "We're too late." His words hung in the air like a death sentence. The heavy silence was broken by a sudden collective sound, the rustling of countless feet, paws, and claws. The monsters, which had been frozen moments ago, turned in unison, all facing the same direction, north. Then, as if commanded by an unseen force, they began to move. Slowly at first, then faster and faster, until they merged into a massive, surging river of creatures fleeing the island. The monsters no longer fought. They didn't even acknowledge the group, even as they passed dangerously close, nearly knocking them over in their frenzy. Their eyes burned with a strange, focused fire, not the frenzied rage of battle, but a chilling, purposeful intensity. They moved with singular determination, oblivious to anything in their path. Some of the creatures hurled themselves into the sea, their bodies slicing through the waves like makeshift boats. Others ran along the shore, leaping off cliffs into the water or continuing their relentless march on land. The torrent of monsters seemed endless. "What's happening?" Lance asked, his voice edged with unease as he watched the chaotic exodus. Andor's expression darkened as he replied, "The final battle is approaching." Richard recalled the elder's cryptic words, "Follow the monsters." The meaning of that command now became painfully clear. All this time, the monsters had been drawn to something, somewhere. And now, with the Crimson Widow destroyed, they were surging toward their ultimate destination, a place tied to the massive rift in the sky. "We have to follow them," Richard said firmly, his gaze locked on the northern horizon. He felt it deep within him, a growing certainty that this moment marked the beginning of the end. Whatever lay ahead, it would be the deciding event, the battle that would determine the fate of their world.